I'm very happy to introduce myself. My name's Adrian Reynolds. Currently work for the same group of churches that Phil works for, about 620 churches, many of which are small and struggling and in need of help, in need of revitalisation. Although that's a reasonably new word to me, but I recognise the context. When I left business, I worked in business for 10 years, and after I left business, I went to pastor a small church, rural church in Hampshire, which was not as small as some of the churches that are in our network, but we didn't call it revitalisation, we didn't know that word, we called it turnaround, but it was in need of change. And I pastored there for 10 years, reasonably successfully, I guess. The church culture did change, and we made progress. I then went to work in London for an organisation training pastors, so I've worked in training for 10 years, and while I was there, I was associate pastor of a large church, and this might surprise you, also a church that needed revitalisation. So a church of 400, but a church that needed revitalisation. And later on, as we talk a little bit, I'll explain why that was. And then a couple of years ago, came to work for the FIEC. What is biblical leadership? Well, there are lots of paradigms in the Bible as to what a leader is. But I think one of the supreme models of leadership is that of a shepherd. It's obviously where we get the word pastor from. The idea of a shepherd really just travels through the whole of the Bible. It starts with the way that God speaks about how he will look after his people, he will shepherd his people. It relates to the way that shepherds were often chosen to be leaders of God's people, whether that was Abraham or whether it was Moses or whether it was David and so on. And all the way through the Old Testament, that is the really predominant theme. More so than king, more so than leader. It tends to be about shepherd, and the imagery of the shepherd who looks after the sheep is obviously a very, very strong one. And it's no surprise, therefore, that when Jesus, who is of course the supreme leader, comes to lead his people, he comes as many things, but also in John chapter 10, he comes as the good shepherd. John chapter 10, which is a great chapter of the scriptures, isn't it, where Jesus talks about being the good shepherd, is essentially a reflection of Ezekiel chapter 34. So in Ezekiel chapter 34, where the nation has really come to its lowest point and the nation is in exile, the Lord brings a word to the people through Ezekiel and complains about the leaders of Israel, the shepherds of Israel. And he says in Ezekiel 34, these are all the things that you do and all the things that you don't do. You're terrible shepherds. That's basically a summary of Ezekiel 34. You're a terrible shepherd. You're looking after yourself first. You're not worrying about the flock. You're even eating the flock. You're not caring for them. You're not feeding them. You're not loving them. And Ezekiel 34 ends with this extraordinary promise that I will come and be their shepherd. And when Jesus therefore comes, and in John chapter 10 talks about being the gate and the shepherd, the good shepherd, he is fulfilling the prophecy of Ezekiel 34, and in fact fulfilling a long line of shepherding leaders. So we haven't got time to look at it now, but it's worth bookmarking John chapter 10 and coming back to that and saying, what do you see in John chapter 10? What does the shepherd do? He knows the sheep. There's a very intimate relationship with them. He loves the sheep. He teaches the sheep listen to him, he protects the sheep, he lays down his life for the sheep. There is a sacrificial sense of his leadership, and all those things and more. And it's no surprise, therefore, that when the New Testament begins to think about leading in the church, it uses the same language, the shepherd of the sheep, the pastor. And actually, Peter in 1 Peter 5 is very explicit about it. He talks about how under-shepherds serve under the great shepherd of the sheep. So the great shepherd of the sheep is Jesus, the leader. And under this great shepherd are under-shepherds who serve in the same way. So all those same characteristics, I think, are transferable, David. The knowing the sheep, loving the sheep, serving the sheep, putting yourself on the line for the sheep, going after the lost sheep, all those kinds of images. I think that's the supreme picture, really, of what leadership is in the Bible. There are many images that are used in the Bible for biblical leadership, many, many images. And some of those images are to do with function, what you do. Some of them are to do with character, how you do it. And some of them are mixed together. So, for example, Paul talks about himself in lots of different ways. He'll describe himself as a fighter. He'll describe himself as an athlete. At one point, he'll even describe himself as refuse. And all these pictures build up an extraordinary picture of leadership. All ultimately, by the way, still pointing to Christ. He is the supreme leader. So leadership is always modelled on him. And we've got to be careful that when we go to the Old Testament and we look at David for models of leadership or Moses, we always need to do that through the lens of Jesus, who comes as a supreme leader. But I think two other words are perhaps particularly helpful. And these words, together with the word pastor, all appear together in Acts chapter 20, when Paul says farewell to the elders from the church in Ephesus. He calls them to Miletus, they come to him. And in that little section, that wonderful section, which is him passing on the leadership baton, if you like, to the next generation, he uses the word pastor, he uses the word elder, and he uses the word overseer. Those three terms, I take it, are synonyms. They're all describing the same role, but in a slightly different way. So the word of pastor is about caring. So the pastor cares, the shepherd cares for the flock, cares and protects. So the pastor word is primarily about caring. The elder word is primarily about bringing wisdom. So immediately you think of someone who is older, you think in Bible terms about someone who has wisdom and brings wisdom to bear. So I think the elder word focuses very much on wisdom. And then the overseer word, I think, is much more about ruling and about directing affairs. So I think those three words perhaps are really helpful as a kind of a little trinity of words that all apply to leadership. But there's one other word that I think we've neglected, and I just want to share with you. And it occurs a couple of times, but primarily in 1 Corinthians 12:28. And in English Bibles for many years, I don't know about your Bibles in the languages, you have to tell me afterwards how 1 Corinthians 12:28 is translated. But in English Bibles, for many years, in that list of spiritual gifts, there was something called the gift of administration. Now, the gift of administration sounds to me a little bit dull. It sounds like you're sticking stamps on envelopes or operating the photocopier or something like that. But actually, the Greek word is kubernesis. It means the pilot of a ship. It's the gift of piloting the ship. And in the ancient world, the pilot of a ship didn't just steer the ship. He was the one who was responsible for going and getting the crew. So he would employ the crew who would work on the ship. He would be the one who would go down to the market and get the cargo and bring the cargo on board. He's the one who would deal with all the authorities. He's the one who would decide where the cargo was going and what route they would take. He kind of was the owner-manager, really, of the ship, the pilot of the ship. And I think that's a great way to think about leadership. It encompasses all of those things: giving direction, giving leading, taking staff on, training them, working with different people. All those kinds of attributes are encapsulated, I think, in that one word. So it's kubernesis. What are the qualities that you need to be a good shepherd? Well, at one level, it's a spiritual thing. So it's pretty clear in the Bible, when you get to Ephesians chapter 4, for example, that it's the risen and ascended Lord Jesus who appoints some to be pastor teachers. So there's a spiritual dimension to it. But it's not just spiritual. There is a responsibility on us. There is a testing on us. I think you see that very clearly, especially in 1 Timothy. I want, if I may, David, just to read a few verses from 1 Timothy. So you might like to turn to these, if you like, and follow along. 1 Timothy 4, verse 11. Because I think in 1 Timothy 4:11 through to the end, 16, you get the two strands of what good leadership are. And the two parts, the two components to good leadership are godliness, 1, gifting, 2. So godliness and gifting. And I want to show you just a moment that both are really essential. I think what we tend to do is we tend to think about gifting especially. And we're going to see in a moment that we have to do that. But actually, Paul, when he comes to thinking about Timothy as a leader, and Timothy, he calls him a young leader. He's probably about 30. So he's not that young, but he's relatively young. It's godliness and gifting. So let me just read these verses. Command and teach these things. Don't let anyone despise your youth, but set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. Until I come, give your attention to public reading, exhortation, and teaching. Don't neglect the gift that is in you, It was given to you through prophecy with the laying on of hands by the council of elders. Practice these things, be committed to them, so that your progress may be evident to all. Pay close attention to your life and your teaching. Persevere in these things, for in doing this you will save both yourself and your hearers. So it seems there that the effectiveness of Timothy's ministry is closely connected to what Paul's been talking about. So in verse 16, Paul can't mean that you actually will save people. That there's only one Saviour, right? And the Saviour is Jesus. So it's not that actually Timothy is going to save people. It means that his ministry will be effective, both in his own life, save yourself, and in the lives of those that he's ministering to, your hearers. And these things that he's to pay a close attention to are the godliness. We know that because verse 11 begins, teach these things, kind of little set of bookends. And the godliness appears in verse 12, doesn't it? Don't let anyone despise your youth, but set an example for the believers. There are 5 elements to this godliness: speech, conduct, love, faith, purity. Perhaps we'll come back to those. He's to be a godly leader, but he's also to be a gifted leader. That's why he's not to neglect the gift that is in you, verse 14. And actually he's to grow in both of those things. Verse 15, practice these things, be committed to them, so that your progress may be evident to all. So actually we can say this from this passage. A good leader is one who is both godly and gifted and growing in both. So growing in godliness, growing in gifting. Whatever stage you've reached, still growing, still growing, still growing. And that seems to be, as Paul writes to Timothy, what is going to be an effective ministry in the church. Let me just say, first of all, it's a particular kind of godliness. So it's not just general godliness. And the reason we know that is because Timothy, if you read on into 2 Timothy, Timothy grew up in a Christian home. He heard the scriptures from infancy. You discover that if you read 2 Timothy 3. 2 Timothy 1, you discover how he inherited his faith. He learned his faith from his mother and his grandmother, who are both godly Christian women. So Timothy is a godly man. You know, I've got 3 daughters. If you had a daughter and they brought Timothy home, you'd be rejoicing. You know, he's the kind of guy you want your daughter to marry. He's a godly man. That's what I'm looking for in a son-in-law. But it seems to me that there is a particular kind of godliness that Paul has in view here, and it's a leadership godliness. All these words, it doesn't at first appear, but all these words are horizontal. They all relate to how we deal with others. So speech is about how we speak to others. Conduct is about how we behave towards others. Love can be love for God. When you read love in the Bible, it's most of all love for others. The 2 are connected, of course. I haven't got time to show you why it is in 1 Timothy, but love here is love for others. Faith is not belief in God. That's one way of translating it, but it's faithfulness. That's the way it's translated in 1 Timothy 5. It's being trustworthy, being dependable, right? So you say you'll do something, you'll do it. You commit to something, you'll carry through. And of course, purity is about sexual conduct, really, those 5 words. So they're all about how a leader relates to the flock, the people that God has given him to serve. So it's not just godliness, he's a godly man, he's a godly leader. So his or her speech is godly. I think, to be honest, David, we don't really need to spend very long thinking what would happen if you're not godly as a leader, because all of us are working in environments where we know of leaders who have fallen sinfully, and we see the impact that has on ministries. Is anyone here from the Republic of Ireland? Anyone here from the Republic of Ireland? If you look at the church statistics in the Republic of Ireland, and how the Republic of Ireland has gone from being really a staunchly Catholic country 15 years ago to now virtually completely secular. And that, if you ask in the various surveys that are done, if you ask people why that is, top of the list, and by far and away the prime reason, is because of the sexual scandals in the church. So we all know, either on a macro scale, or sometimes a bit closer to home, people we know, friends even, we all know that a lack of godliness destroys ministry, it undermines ministry. But let's just turn it around. 1 Peter chapter 3, slightly different context, but in 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter is writing to Christian wives who have non-Christian husbands. and they've obviously become Christians after they've got married. And he says to them, you can win over their hearts. They've heard the gospel, they're not believing it yet, but how you live adorns the gospel. So let's not be entirely negative, let's be positive. A godly leader actually authenticates the gospel, makes it believable. So what is the context in which this can be modelled? The context has to be the model of ministry that Paul espouses in 1 Thessalonians. You share your lives with people. So the leadership of the flock, and that's why I think the shepherding word is helpful, is leading the flock by being amongst the flock. So a shepherd does not sit in an office. If you've ever tried to shepherd, you probably haven't, but you can imagine if you were trying to look after a flock of sheep from an office, it doesn't work. It's not going to work. You need to be out there, don't you? I mean, with technology today, maybe you'd be out on your quad bike, but you still need to be out there with the sheep. And that's the idea, I think, that's in 1 Thessalonians. So it's very evident, I think, whether you are a godly leader or not, if you are really sharing your lives with people. I'm slightly suspicious of leaders who don't share their lives with people. Perhaps I'm a bit too pessimistic, but I'm wondering whether they've got something to hide sometimes. I think sharing your lives is recognising that you're not just a leader of a congregation, but you're also a member of a congregation. So I think it means doing all the things you wish people in the congregation would do. So it is hospitality, but it's also having friendships, it's being willing to be corrected, it's hanging out with people, it's doing things for the good of others. It's all those Christian characteristics that we're often preaching and teaching on all the time. And so, you know, when I go home and I say to my wife, I wish the church was more like this, and she says, I wish you were more like that. It's that kind of thing. You know, we're church members as well as church leaders. Well, I think so. Let's answer a broad question first, which is there are certain prerequisites you need to be in leadership, which I think are non-negotiable. So, for example, if you're going to lead a church and you're going to be the main leader, you need to be able to teach the Bible. So, Timothy is in 1 Timothy 3 is to look for other leaders who are apt to teach. So it seems to me that there are some of these non-negotiables, if you like. So if I don't know, I was meeting Hank earlier. Hank works in the Czech Republic. I think that's right. Yeah. If Hank was looking for a colleague to come and work with him in the Czech Republic, and I applied for the job, and he phoned me up for an interview, and he said, "Do you speak Czech?" I said, "No, not a chance." Then he would say, "Well, you can't come and work. You can't come and work with me and do the work that I want you to do." So clearly, we realise that there is a base level of gifting that is required. But I think beyond that, none of us are the Messiah, and therefore none of us have every single gift in abundance. And so very often, I think the key to gifting in leadership is knowing what we can do, but also knowing what we can't do, and finding ways to compensate for the things that we can't do. Now, in a small church, that's a battle, right? It's difficult. So if, for example, you find some things straightforward but other things more difficult, your church can't afford to employ someone else, maybe you don't have someone else in the church with gifts, you've got to go and find them somewhere else. So let me give you a really... It's an inoffensive example, because I don't want to offend anybody. So here's an inoffensive example. Let's say you have no musicians in your church, and you're not a musician. Well, you find a way to get some music. You either find a way to sing unaccompanied, you find someone with a good voice if you've got someone in the church, or you buy some software that will play the music, or you find some way to make it happen. And I think one of the things that we need to do, especially when I was in a smaller church context, is I needed to be very honest about the things I couldn't do. I needed to work on the things I could and improve them. And if there were things that I just couldn't do, I needed to be honest about that and find different ways to get that expertise in the church. I think the primary quality for a leader is that he or she loves his or her people. So I think in the churches that we see, and Phil, perhaps you'll be able to comment on this as well, a leader who has no love, regard, care, concern, compassion for his or her people, that church is always doomed to failure, always. It might last 5 years, it might just get by on some previous history, but ultimately it will always be doomed. So if you don't love the people you're serving, you are in real trouble. And of course the shepherd loves his sheep and gives his life for her. That's what Jesus says in John chapter 10. So I think that's the primary quality. And if that is missing, then you are in trouble. I've been teaching downstairs actually about godliness and gifting going together, and it's been interesting how for many people that's it's not a new idea, but they've not really thought about it. Come to the forum to get equipped. That's what are we going to do at the forum? We're going to learn as much as we can, take as much as we can in. And I've been trying to say to the guys downstairs, you come to the forum not only to be equipped, but also to be thinking of yourself soberly. That's the way that Paul writes. Think of yourself soberly. In other words, think about how you need to grow in godliness and let God's word minister to you. So I'd love you just in twos or threes maybe to answer this question. Just think about godliness and gifting together. And maybe answer this. Which of those do you find it easier to focus on? And remember, it's not just general godliness, this is leadership godliness. Which of those do you find it easier to focus on and why? That's the first question. Second question, what could you do just to change the balance a little bit? So 2 simple questions. Which do you find it easier, godliness or gifting, to focus on and why? You might like to look at that passage again. And what can you do to redress the balance? The basic aim of leadership, I think, is to bring about change. That's what the gospel is, isn't it? The gospel is about change. So it's fundamentally about the change from not being a Christian to being a Christian. So it's going from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light. But actually, even then, when you are a Christian, the gospel is still about change. So the gospel is still about being transformed from one degree of glory to another. That's how Paul puts it at the end of 2 Corinthians chapter 3. So it's glorious to be in the kingdom of light when you were in the kingdom of darkness. That's glorious. But that's one degree of glory. And there's a process, we call it sanctification, of course, which is to bring us from one degree of glory to another so that we're more and more like Christ. So when you're teaching in church, preaching, teaching, you're leading a Bible study, whatever it may be, what do you want? You want people to change. You want people to be more like Christ. So the gospel is fundamentally about change. And therefore, leadership is fundamentally about helping people change. Now, the odd thing about that is that churches which recognize that find it very difficult to change themselves. So there's this mismatch between knowing that the gospel is about change and actually wanting just to stay the same. And I think maybe that's at the root of many of the challenges that we have in church life, is that people actually are very resistant to change. And that's true in terms of godliness, isn't it? So actually, the work of sanctification is not an easy thing, is it? It's not, you don't just have to kind of lie in the bath and with the bubbles floating up and think, oh, I'm going to be holier in an hour's time. It doesn't happen like that yet. It's hard work. It's a work that God does in us, but it's a work that we partner with him in. And it's hard work. It's harder work. Just think about that list: speech, conduct, love, faith, purity. Just think about speech. You have to work hard for your speech to be godly and to be more godly next year than you were this year and more godly the following year. So it shouldn't surprise us that when it comes to change in church culture, people are also resistant. It's part of the human nature, I think. Yeah. Okay. I think we need to recognize that only a godly and gifted leader can bring about change with God's help. So I think if we assume that by giftedness alone we will be able to effect change, or by godliness alone we will be able to effect change, I think we're going against what Scripture teaches, and frankly it's quite naive. So we need both godliness and gifting. I think we need to be realistic about what needs to change in church life, and that will differ from church to church. I've just, as you were answering your questions, I just jotted down 5 things from my own experience that need to change often in churches, certainly the 2 that I've been in. And this is actually where the large church I served comes in. So this church of 350, 400 people, we had 2 congregations, an English-speaking congregation and a Russian-speaking congregation, and both trying to reach out to people in East London, and actually the Russian-speaking congregation across the diaspora of Russian speakers in London. But actually, when you looked at the people who were in the church compared to the people who lived around the church, you realise actually the church only had 15 years to go. And in 15 years' time, the youngest people in church who were active, who were all in their 50s, would all be in their late 60s, 70s, and the church suddenly there would be nothing there. So I think just because a church is large doesn't mean it doesn't need revitalising. So the 5 things I thought about, you might want to jot these down. Phil, you can chip in, you'll think of others. I thought about culture. So just the whole feel of how a church is. I thought about structure, by which I mean how a church is structured in terms of its leadership and the people who serve in it, especially the leaders though. I thought about programme. Often churches need to change their programmes. They're still running the programmes from 50 years ago, or they're running programmes they don't need to, or they're running programmes that actually they haven't got the people to run. People, sometimes the wrong people are doing the wrong things in church. And in a small church especially, we've got a saying in England, which is you cut your coat according to the cloth. It comes from the coat making industry, the jacket making industry, that you can only work with what you've got. That's what that means. And there's no point saying we're going to run a toddler ministry in our church if you haven't got anybody who can work with toddlers. So sometimes just the wrong people are doing the wrong things. They're just not gifted. And then I think the 5th one is buildings or location. Let's make it location. Not everyone has a building. Sometimes churches just have the wrong buildings or are in the wrong place. And sometimes it's as simple as they need to move where they are. We know of churches, and I've been in churches. In fact, the church I was in, where I told you about this first church that I was pastoring, they were at the end of a long lane, which was stuck out on the edge of town. The town had good roads, but this lane had potholes. You couldn't really drive down it, and no one ever drove up the lane. And then people were surprised when no one ever came to church because you couldn't actually get to it. And it was a simple answer. We had to move where we were. The simple answer to that is yes. Do we still have the same structure of leadership? Yes, I believe so. So I think the ideal in a church is a plural leadership, not just one man. Now, sometimes this comes back to cutting your coat according to the cloth. If you're in a small church, you're just getting going, you're 8 or 9 people, there might not be 2 people who are qualified for leadership. And so sometimes you have to compromise on some things, but whenever you compromise, which you sometimes have to do, you must never let that become your norm. So you say, I'm going to do this for a while just because of the situation I'm in, but it doesn't become my norm. So let me give an example of how that works. I know of a church, for example, where the church is small, just have one leader, and the leader says to me, I wish I had other leaders, but I haven't got other leaders. So what do? He said, I've got another man I know who's in the next town. I could meet up with him, but I'm an independent. And so that's compromising my independence. What do I do about that? To which the answer is, I say, well, meet up with him. He's going to be able to give you some of the things another leader will give you. He'll be able to give you some wisdom. He'll perhaps be able to hold you accountable at some level. But he's not a leader of your church because you've got this conviction about being an independent. So you're having to compromise at some level. But you do say that's not what I want my ultimate structure to be like. So I think, yes, plural leaders in church I think is always healthier. And actually, our observation in the UK is that where churches get into real trouble, where a pastor or a leader fails, morally, perhaps doctrinally, or leaves, churches that have plural leaderships very often survive, sometimes even thrive in those contexts. Whereas churches that don't, often the whole thing falls apart. So the question is, should you do only the things that you're gifted to do, or should you be doing all kinds of things in leadership? So I think I want to turn the question around a little bit. Leadership is a function of what the church is, right? So the church is not ever my church or your church. The church is the church of Jesus Christ, and he appoints pastor teachers into the church so that the church can be what the church ought to be. That's very clear in Ephesians chapter 4. So I think the fundamental question is not primarily what can you do as a leader, but what actually is the calling of the church. Now, the calling of the church is clear in Scripture. There's no question about that. The calling of the church is to care for those who are in the church. It is to preach the gospel to those who are not believers, and it is to see those who are believers built up in the faith. So you might describe those in different ways, but essentially it is to reach people, it's to build people, it's to care for people, it's to send people, it's those kinds of things. So a good local church is doing those four things. And a good leader is using his or her gifts to help the church do those things. Now, they might be better at doing one or two of those than others, but they should never just be working on those exclusively. So, for example, I wish I was a better evangelist. I'm not as good an evangelist as I'd love to be. I have a good go, but it's not a primary gifting. I think I'm probably more of a Bible teacher. But I can't just say because that's not my gift, I don't want to do it, because that is the calling of the church. So I've got to make sure as a leader that either me or someone in the church is doing the work of an evangelist, and together as a church, we're reaching people with the good news of Jesus Christ. So I think I want to always see my gifting not simply as a relationship between myself and God, what has God called me to do, but actually what has God called the church to do, and how has he equipped me to serve in the church? Does that make sense? A slightly different way of answering the question, but I think actually it's primarily not about me, it's about how I serve those that God has given into my care. If you are in a denomination, what do you think about that in terms of revitalisation? Can you do that within a denomination? So within the UK, within England, where I am, we have a mix of denominations and independents. In terms of evangelicals, most of the evangelicals who are in denominations would either be in the Baptist Union or they would be Anglicans. Don't have any Presbyterians really in England. So those, and some, but not many in the Assemblies of God, Pentecostals. So those would be the three main groupings. But those who are working hard at revitalisation, also Anglicans and Baptist Union. Now, Anglicans, for them, revitalisation looks very different than from our context. So in our context, revitalisation is generally about churches getting very small and helping those churches turn around culture, structure, leadership, people, programs, so that they can be revitalised under God. For Anglicans, I've got lots of friends who are in Anglican revitalisation projects. For most of them, they are leading churches which are full of unbelievers. So their issue is not actually the same as our issues in our churches. Their issue is they've just got 50 people in their congregation and probably only one or two of them are converted. So that's more like being a missionary in some ways and having a ready group of people. And I know people who are doing that from within denominations and doing it very successfully. So if the denomination is supportive, there's no reason why it can't work. So that's my biblical conviction about church governments. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's the only one. In the Baptist Union is a strange mix of the two. The Baptist Union in the UK is actually made up of independent churches, but there's still some control. It's a slightly odd mix. Interestingly, in the Baptist Union and in the Anglican Church, the key issue that is facing every church is what they think about same-sex marriage. So I think the challenge is in the Anglican Church, they're not allowed to conduct same-sex marriages, but some of them want to, not evangelicals, some of the churches want to. In the Baptist Union, they are allowed to conduct same-sex marriages, and some of them do, including the top Baptist Union church in the country, in Bloomsbury Baptist Church in London, conducts same-sex weddings. So actually, what happens in a denomination is it's very easy to be distracted from the actual work that's in front of you. So I think if you're going to do revitalisation work in a denomination, you need to be able to isolate yourself from national issues that don't concern you. So if, for example, if you were in a Baptist Union church in the UK and you thought to yourself, of course I'm never going to embrace same-sex marriage, you need to be able to put that to one side and just forget about what others are doing and just concentrate on the work in front of you. And if you can't do that, then I think you do have some trouble ahead. So yes, of course you can, yeah. So other people, and over history, people have believed in denominations and would disagree with me. Calvin would disagree with me very strongly, and I would happily sit at his feet till the day I die. If there is no trust between a congregation and its leaders, then the leadership cannot be effective. It just cannot. So it's interesting, I was being interviewed just a while ago about what are the circumstances in which a pastor should leave a church? It's a very big question. But actually one of the circumstances, if there is no trust between a leader and a congregation, the church simply can't work. And so actually generating trust and working hard at keeping trust is really important. And that's the same kind of idea. It's the link between the congregation and the leaders. There has to be this close link. And if that link is broken because they have different aspirations or different desires or even different beliefs, then actually the church it's never going to be revitalized. The question is, how much do you show that change is part of Christian life, or how much do you change early on? All those sorts of questions about change. There are lots of different theories about what you change and how much you change. I was always taught at college that you shouldn't change anything in the first year. The challenge with that is that if you don't change anything in the first year, it's very difficult to change anything at all. So I took the view that I wanted to get the church thinking about change. This is in a turnaround situation. I wanted to get the church thinking about change very early. But actually there were some quite low-level changes that I thought could be made that would require the church just to think carefully, but actually would start to bring about a culture. So in the church that I was in, the big thing was changing the culture. That was the big thing. But we needed better seats, because we had really uncomfortable wooden seats that had splinters in, so when you sat on them, it got quite painful. And so we needed some new seats. Now, new seats are expensive. So actually, the church had to commit money to doing something about it, but they could see the benefit.